Good morning. It's Thursday morning, and we're here at the bridge to focus on the future. And for us, over the last few weeks, that's meant that we are following the growth of the early church and how they pursued the future that God had for them. Remember our theme this year, our future, God's plans. And so we've been drawing some lessons from the growth of the early church. Do you remember the four things? You remember the four priorities of the early church, the things they devoted themselves to? We looked at that a few weeks ago. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, communion, and to prayer. It's the last of those that we want to focus on this morning. Prayer. There are many prayers in the Bible. The ones that come to my mind are the prayer of Solomon for wisdom. Do you remember that? Where God said, ask anything you want. And Solomon, out of all of the things he could have prayed for, asked for wisdom. Then there's the prayer of Nehemiah, where he comes before God after Jerusalem had been destroyed, and he was the cupbearer to the king in a different land, and he prayed that God would use him and send him to help rebuild Jerusalem. And then, of course, in the New Testament, there's the Lord's Prayer, most notably, the prayer that Jesus gave his disciples. And then there is this prayer that we look at in Acts chapter 4. You might call it the believer's prayer. We have the Lord's Prayer that he gave us. Here's the believer's prayer. And it's a prayer that grows out of a particular situation. And that is a situation where Peter and John had healed a man who was lame, who was on the side of the road near the temple, and he was asking for money. And Peter said, I don't have any silver or gold, but I'll give you what I do have. In the name of Jesus Christ, rise up and walk. And he healed the man. And that caused a stir. And Peter and John used that miracle as an opportunity to preach about Jesus. And when they preached about Jesus, the religious rulers gathered them up and threatened them and warned them not to do that, to which Peter wisely replied, hey, does it make sense to you that we should obey you rather than God? And they just went right on preaching. They went back to their church family. They gathered together, and they reported everything that had happened, and then they prayed together the believer's prayer. Basically, it has three parts. They did three things in that prayer. First, they acknowledged the sovereignty of God. The prayer begins with the words, Sovereign Lord. And so before they asked anything, they acknowledged that God was the ruler, God was in control. They acknowledged the sovereignty of God. It's a good example for us. When we go to prayer, we have needs in our lives, and we have things we want to ask God for. We want to ask for his help. But we should begin by acknowledging that he is in control. He is the one with the perfect plan before we ask anything. It's our future, but it's God's plans. And so they acknowledged the sovereignty of God. And then the second thing they did was to ask for boldness, that they might continue to preach in the name of Jesus, because they were human and they did the right thing, but in order to continue to do the right thing in the face of opposition, they would need God's help. They would need God's boldness. And then third, they closed the prayer by asking that God would confirm their words, their preaching, with signs and miracles. And then they went out and they continued their ministry. And we read another little snapshot of the early church as it grew through prayer and through the apostles doing the right thing. We read that they had everything in common, that there was no needy person among them, and God was just blessing them. Our church, the future of any church, does not depend on careful planning or man-made programs. It depends on prayer and leaning upon God and doing the right thing and being blessed by God. That's our lesson this morning from the experience of the early church. So God bless your Thursday. Remember, we have a baptism and a summer splash on Sunday, weather permitting. We'll be baptizing 5 people, and then we will have a picnic and just a good time together. So you're welcome to that. Please RSVP on this note if you're going to come, so we can have an idea of numbers, and have a wonderful Thursday.